My name is Meredith Calloway. I'm 58. Monday mornings at the hospital always start the same way. Coffee too strong, fluorescent lights too bright, and a conference table crowded with people who talk in numbers more than words. I'm a financial administrator, which means my job is to keep other people's chaos in order. Budgets, reimbursements, invoices. Nothing ever surprises me anymore. Or so I thought. We were halfway through a discussion on equipment costs when my phone buzzed on the table. A small vibration, nothing unusual, but something in the sound made my stomach tighten. I glanced down expecting another billing reminder or a message from a supplier. Instead, I saw my son's name. Send $3,000 today. Or don't call yourself my mother. The room went silent around me, though everyone else kept talking. My hand froze halfway to my coffee cup. I reread the message, thinking I'd misunderstood it. Thinking maybe there was some missing piece, a joke, a mistake. But no, it was all there, blunt and final. For a moment, the hospital boardroom felt airless. My chest burned like I'd swallowed the words whole. I turned my phone face down on the folder in front of me, hoping no one noticed the tremor in my fingers. When the meeting ended, I walked the corridor toward my office, the soles of my shoes clicking too loudly on the tile. The sound steadied me. Routine steadied me. I've lived most of my adult life by routine: wake early, pack lunch balance numbers, solve other people's messes. It's what kept me sane after my husband died 22 years ago. It's what raised a boy who once held my hand walking into school. Now that boy had sent me a demand like an unpaid invoice. I closed my office door and sat behind the desk. The phone screen stared up at me, waiting. My first instinct was to reply right away, ask what happened, why he needed it, whether he was in trouble. I'd done it before: rent money, car repairs, just this once, emergencies. Dylan always sounded grateful at first and then distant once the transfer went through. But this message was different. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. For the rest of the day, I drifted through work like a ghost, signing forms and answering questions, but my thoughts never left that single sentence. I checked my phone more times than I'll admit, waiting for a follow-up text, an apology, anything. None came. By the time I drove home, the city had turned gray with drizzle. The streets along the river shimmered with headlights, and I caught my reflection in the windshield. Tired eyes, the lines of too many careful years. At a red light, I almost typed back, "We'll talk later." I stopped myself. There was nothing to talk about yet. My house sat in a quiet neighborhood east of the Willamette, the kind where people still wave from their porches. I'd lived there since Dylan was 6. The porch light has burned almost every night since then, sometimes for him, sometimes for me. Habit more than hope. I unlocked the door, kicked off my shoes, and dropped my bag on the counter. The house smelled faintly of rain and coffee grounds. I heated a can of soup, though I barely tasted it. Every few minutes, I'd pick up the phone again, scroll to the message, and stare at it as if it might rewrite itself. $3,000, I said aloud, my voice thin against the hum of the refrigerator. For what, Dylan? The walls didn't answer. I sat at the kitchen table long after the soup went cold, remembering all the times I'd promised myself I'd stop sending money. Each time guilt won. Each time I convinced myself he just needed time, that it was temporary. But tonight felt different. The words had weight, like something had broken clean through the surface we'd both been pretending was still intact. Outside, the rain softened into mist. I walked to the porch and turned on the light. The bulb flickered once before steadying into a pale circle that stretched across the front steps. I stood there with my phone in my hand, the screen glowing faintly against the dark. The text, still waited there, simple and cruel. I didn't reply. Not yet. I stayed there until the street grew quiet, until the rain stopped, and the air smelled like wet cedar. Somewhere down the block, a car door closed, and for a second, I thought I saw Dylan's silhouette, tall and restless, the way he looked before leaving for college years ago. But the street was empty. I went inside, locked the door, and set my phone face down on the table. Tomorrow, I told myself I'd decide what to do. When I think of Dylan, I don't see the man who sent that message. I see the boy who used to wake up before me on school days, padding into the kitchen in mismatched socks, determined to make coffee just the way I liked it. Half a spoon of sugar, splash of milk, stirred exactly 6 times, because he once overheard me say that even numbers made things feel balanced. He was gentle, then gentle, in a way that made other mothers stop me at the grocery store and say, "You raised him right." I used to believe that too. I believed it when he helped our elderly neighbor carry groceries, when he patched the loose screen door with duct tape, when he called me Mama long after his friends had switched to Mom. After his father's accident, everything in the house felt quieter, even the walls. Dylan was 16, too old to cry in front of his friends, but young enough to still need someone to tuck in his grief. He didn't talk much that summer. Instead, he fixed things. The porch steps, the flickering hallway light, the hinge on the back gate. He'd work until dusk, his shoulders shaking with effort, and when I told him to rest, he'd say, "I'm fine, Mom. I just don't want the house to fall apart." Neither of us admitted that he wasn't really talking about the house. He went to college in Corvallis a year later on a small scholarship and a mountain of hope. I remember the day we unpacked his dorm room, 2 suitcases, a second-hand desk lamp, and a framed photo of the 3 of us from his 10th birthday. He hugged me before I left, tight and wordless. I cried the whole drive home, proud and terrified in equal measure. The calls started that fall. First, it was small things, books, lab fees, a broken laptop. I told myself every parent helps out sometimes. Then came the bigger ones. They're raising tuition again. My car broke down. I just need to make it through finals. Each time I transferred the money before he finished explaining. Each time I felt useful. Needed. I kept every receipt in a folder marked college support and filed it beside the electric bill as if responsibility could be organized that way. When Dylan dropped out 2 years later, he told me it was temporary. He wanted to work, save money, go back stronger. I believed him because I wanted to. I helped him rent an apartment, co-signed a loan for a used car, and sent grocery money just until he found his footing. But the footing never came. Sometimes he'd visit on weekends, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and coffee, talking fast about new ideas, moving to Seattle, starting a business, going back to school. I'd not offer leftovers, ask if he was eating well. He'd smile and say, "Always, Mom." Then he'd ask if I could spot him until the next paycheck. I told myself it was just a rough patch. Everyone stumbles. I remembered the boy who built things when he was hurting and believed he'd build himself back too. Years blurred that way, one transfer after another kindness, measured in digits. When I bought this house, he helped paint the living room a soft gray. He laughed, told me it felt grown up. I thought maybe that meant he was changing. For a while, we talked about paying off his debt together like a team. I wanted to believe in that word, together. But the debt grew like mold behind a wall, unseen, spreading quietly through everything. Now, sitting at the same kitchen table where he once drank hot chocolate and told me about his dreams, I wonder when exactly things shifted. Maybe it was the day I stopped asking him to pay me back. Maybe it was the day he realized I never would. I finish my cold soup, rinse the bowl, and set it in the sink. The porch light outside is still burning, the same one he wired himself when he was 17, grinning as he flipped the switch. "Now you'll never come home to darkness," he said. Tonight, the light hums softly against the glass. I turn it off for the first time in years. Then I stand there for a long moment, staring into the quiet house, feeling the weight of every dollar, every promise, every excuse that once sounded like love. The silence feels heavier than the rain. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know this something has ended. And something else, something small and painful and necessary, has begun. The rain started again before midnight, soft and steady, tapping against the kitchen window like it wanted to remind me of something I'd forgotten. I made another cup of coffee I didn't need and carried my laptop to the table. The porch light outside was off now, but its reflection lingered faintly in the glass, a ghost of habit. The screen glowed pale blue as I opened my banking app. It took a moment for the numbers to load the little spinning circle, turning like a clock hand too afraid to stop. When the list finally appeared, my breath caught. There they were, rows and rows of transfers. Tuition payments, car insurance deposits, labeled emergency rent, help short-term loan. Each line carried a story I remembered too well. $150 that winter, Dylan said his heat had gone out. $900 the month his car broke down on I-5. $400 for textbooks he never returned. $1,200 after he promised to start therapy. The columns blurred together until they no longer looked like money, but pieces of me shaved thin and sent out into a world that rarely said thank you. For years I'd told myself it was love, that this was what good mothers did. They filled the gaps, paid the bills, made sure no one drowned. I'd even joked about it once at work, calling myself the family bank of last resort. Everyone had laughed. So had I. But sitting there now, the joke felt cruel. I scrolled further back past the familiar years to the first transfer on record. It was dated 10 years ago, his college orientation week. The payment memo read simply, "For everything you need." I remembered writing it that way because I meant it. I wanted him to feel safe to know that even if the world turned cold, there would always be one place that stayed warm. But warmth, I was starting to understand, can also burn. The rain thickened, running down the glass in narrow, crooked streams. From where I sat, the drops looked like ink, bleeding over numbers, washing them clean of meaning. I rubbed at my temple and stared at the total. The sum wasn't enormous by some standards, but it was enough to make me feel dizzy enough to buy a new roof, maybe a trip I'd always postponed. Enough to mean that I'd built my life around someone else's emergencies. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint tick of the old wall clock. It struck me how quiet the house had become since Dylan moved out. I used to fill the silence with excuses. Now it just sounded like what it was absence. I clicked through the oldest transactions again, one by one, and tried to match each with the memory it belonged to. The night he came home drunk and crying, the week he quit another job, the month he said he'd finally start saving. Every payment had been a promise next time things would be different, but next time never came. My fingers hovered over the touchpad, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt tired, an exhaustion that lived deeper than bone, the kind that comes from holding up a wall no one else tries to rebuild. The kettle whistled faintly from the stove. I didn't get up. I stared at the laptop until the screen dimmed to black, showing only my reflection, lined still and unfamiliar. Outside, the rain began to slow, leaving streaks across the glass like the ink trails of a ledger finally closed. I reached out, closed the laptop, and let the dark fill the room. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried that metallic scent that always follows a long storm. I stood by the kitchen window with my phone in hand, staring at the contact name on the screen. Dylan Calloway. I'd typed and deleted his number so many times over the years that I knew it by heart. though I'd never needed to. He always called first. Not this time. The silence between us since his message had stretched into something sharp. I didn't know if I was calling to demand an explanation or just to hear his voice again. My thumb hovered over the green icon, then pressed. He answered on the third ring. Yeah. His tone was clipped, distant, the kind he used with strangers. It's me, I said quietly. Your mother. A pause. Then, did you send it? Send what, the money? My throat tightened. No, Dylan, not this time. For a moment, there was only the faint hum of static between us. Then he exhaled hard, a sound that carried more irritation than surprise. You can't just decide that. You owe me, Mom. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Owe you? Yeah. After Dad died. Who do you think kept things together? Who fixed the house? Who worked double shifts so you could keep yours? You forget who carried who. His words came fast, jagged like he'd been saving them for years. I gripped the phone tighter. You were 16, I said. You helped. I was grateful. But I was still your mother, Dylan. I was the one who kept the lights on who you were falling apart, he interrupted. You didn't even leave the house for months. I took care of everything. You'd still be stuck in that house if it weren't for me. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit because they weren't entirely wrong. After my husband's accident, I'd spent months in a fog of paperwork and grief, moving through days like a machine. Dylan had been the one fixing things, the porch, the gate, the bills. I forgot to pay. He'd even learned to drive early so he could pick up groceries. I'd told him thank you 1,000 times, each one another thread in the rope that bound us. But somewhere along the way, those thank yous had turned into permission. Dylan, I said carefully, helping your family doesn't mean they owe you for life. He laughed, short and bitter. You always twist things. You'd have nothing if it wasn't for me. You'd still be in debt. You'd still be crying over Dad every night. I closed my eyes. The old guilt rose up again, thick and familiar. There were nights, long after he'd gone to bed, when I'd sit in the dark living room and cry quietly into a dish towel so he wouldn't hear. Maybe he had. Maybe that's when he started believing I needed saving. You don't understand, he said, his voice lowering. I'm not asking for much. $3,000, Mom. That's nothing compared to what you owe me. Something inside me hardened, not anger exactly, but a kind of final clarity. No, I said softly. I don't owe you, Dylan. I loved you, I still do, but love isn't a debt. He went silent again, and for a second I thought the call had dropped. Then he muttered, You'll regret this. The line clicked dead. I stared at the phone for a long time, the screen dimming, until my reflection appeared in the glass. The look on my face startled me. Not grief this time, but something steadier. Outside, a patch of sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the wet driveway. It had been so long since I'd seen that kind of light, without wondering who I had to pay for it. I set the phone down on the counter, the air still vibrating faintly with his voice. For the first time in years, I didn't reach for my wallet. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed with the phone glowing faintly on the nightstand, its light painting a cold line across the ceiling. The house was silent, except for the steady hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the rain dripping from the gutters outside. My mind wouldn't stop replaying his voice, sharp, accusing. Still my son's, but hollowed out by something colder. I turned on my side, picked up the phone, and opened our message thread. The scroll felt endless, years of small talk and gratitude woven with demands. Thanks, Mom. You're the best. Can you send a little extra this month? Each message began with affection and ended with need. I'd always answered. Sometimes with words, sometimes with money, always with reassurance. It's okay, honey. Don't worry, you'll get through this. I could see now how that phrase had become a spell, one I'd cast over both of us to hide the truth. I was terrified of being the reason he failed, so I became the reason he never had to try. I scrolled further back to messages from when he was in college. His tone was different then, lighter, almost shy. Got an A on my paper. Made a new friend. Miss you, Mom. I smiled at those, and for a second the ache eased. But it didn't last. The next message was another request, another small withdrawal from whatever we still had between us. The phone buzzed in my hand. A new text appeared. We're going to talk about this tomorrow. No apology, no warmth, just a declaration. I stared at the words until they blurred. I placed the phone face down on the comforter and sat up. The air was cool, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones when your heart's already tired. I walked to the window, pulled the curtain back, and looked out at the quiet street. The porch light was still off, but the reflection of the rain shimmered on the pavement like threads of silver. For so long, I'd lived for the next call, the next message, the next crisis to fix. That night at 2 a.m, I realized I couldn't keep doing it. The guilt that had guided me for decades had turned into something heavier, something that had its hands around both our throats. I whispered the word before I even knew I'd said it. Enough. The sound was soft, but it felt like the first true thing I'd spoken in years. I turned away from the window and let the darkness settle, not as a threat this time, but as a kind of mercy. The rain returned that evening harder than before, sweeping against the windows like 1,000 small fists. It was the kind of storm that made the world sound distant, as if everything outside the walls had been washed away. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the glow cutting a clean circle of light through the dimness. The clock on the stove read 8:42 p.m. For hours, I had done nothing but think about his voice on the phone, the words that had hit like stones. You owe me. I'd heard them over and over in my mind until they began to lose shape, until they became background noise to something deeper, the realization that if I didn't stop, I would spend the rest of my life paying for his pain. I took a breath and opened my banking page. The familiar login screen blinked, asking for my password. I typed slowly, deliberately, as if each keystroke mattered. The first account appeared, the joint one I had opened years ago just in case. The one I'd used to send small amounts groceries, repairs tuition hope. The balance stared back at me, a sum that could have been my peace of mind long gone in drips and transfers. My cursor hovered over the scheduled payments tab. The list was long. I clicked the first one. Stop transfer. The confirmation box appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this transaction? Yes, I whispered. Click. The next one. Remove beneficiary. Click. Then another. Cancel authorization. Click. Each sound felt louder than the storm. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something that felt almost like release. For years, I had been so careful, budgeting, saving, hiding my exhaustion behind steady spreadsheets. It had never occurred to me that I could reclaim the same precision for myself. The laptop chimed softly with each confirmation. One by one, the automatic transfers disappeared from the queue until the screen was blank. My chest rose and fell slower now, as if I were finally breathing air that hadn't been borrowed. When I opened the second account, the one linked to his credit card, I hesitated. That card had started as a safety net. It had turned into a hole. I scrolled through the list of charges, gas stations, restaurants, online subscriptions I didn't recognize. It wasn't the money that stung, but the intimacy of it. Every purchase was a small claim on my trust. My finger hovered over the deactivate card option. Outside, thunder cracked low and rolling like the earth itself was waiting for me to decide. Click. The notification appeared instantly. This card has been deactivated. A tear slipped down my cheek and landed on the trackpad. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was a quiet, physical proof of something shifting, something I hadn't known I still had the power to move. I leaned back in the chair, watching the rain streak down the window in crooked paths. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, a woman who looked both older and lighter than she had the night before. I thought of the years I'd spent teaching Dylan to ride his bike to drive to take care of himself. I remembered the way he'd once looked back at me from the end of the driveway, waving before turning the corner. I hadn't realized until now that I'd never stopped standing there waiting for him to come back. The rain softened. I closed the banking window and opened another utilities insurance, anything tied to his name. Cancel. Remove. Close. The words blurred together until they no longer sounded harsh. They sounded clean. When I finally shut the laptop, the house was utterly still. No hum from the heater, no drip from the sink, just the soft hiss of rain easing into mist. I went to the living room and turned off the last lamp. The darkness felt different this time, thicker, but safer, as if the house had exhaled with me. For years I'd told myself that love meant giving until it hurt. I hadn't realized that sometimes love meant stopping before there was nothing left to give. I ran a hand across the smooth surface of the table, tracing the faint ring from where my coffee cup had been. Then I whispered into the quiet, "It's done." The words didn't echo. They settled low, final, and steady. Outside, the porch light flickered once, as if testing its own endurance before shining steady through the rain. I watched it for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass, and felt something new press softly against the edge of my chest. It wasn't guilt. It was space. At 8:37 the next morning, the first call came. I was standing by the kitchen window, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, when the vibration rattled across the counter. I didn't have to check the screen. There was only one person who could call with that kind of fury pulsing through the ringtone. Mom Dylan's voice exploded before I could speak. "You froze my account. What the hell is wrong with you?" The sound hit like a slammed door in my ear. I set the mug down carefully, afraid of spilling it, though my hands were steady. I stopped the transfers, I said, my voice low. "You need to handle things yourself now. You can't just decide," that he shouted. "You left us with nothing. Do you understand? Nothing." I heard the muffled crash of something in the background, maybe a cupboard or a chair. Then another voice joined Erin. "Are you proud of yourself?" she snapped. "We can't pay rent. You've destroyed us." Her tone was sharp and high, the kind that pierces through walls. I remembered meeting her for the first time at their small wedding reception, how polite she'd been, how her hand trembled slightly when she reached for the champagne. I'd wanted to believe she was nervous, not fearful. Now her anger filled the space between us. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The words had weight, but none of them were mine to carry anymore. Dylan grabbed the phone back. "You always talk about love, about family. What kind of mother cuts off her own son?" The question hung there echoing. I almost told him the kind of mother who's been drained dry, but instead I said nothing. Outside, the city was still waking. The clouds over Portland hung low and heavy, their reflection dulling the glass of the high-rises. Everything looked muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He cursed once, twice, then hung up. The silence that followed felt deeper than the noise had been. I picked up my mug, took a sip, and waited. The second call came minutes later, then another. By 10 o'clock, my phone had filled with missed calls and angry voicemails, each one a different shade of the same desperation. How could you? We need help. You've ruined our lives. Each accusation felt like thunder rolling through the same sky, loud and temporary. After every outburst came quiet, thin, clean, almost holy. I muted the phone and let it vibrate itself into exhaustion. The kitchen smelled of coffee and rain. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. For the first time in years, I didn't reach for my purse or my passwords. I didn't rush to fix anything. I stood there instead, watching the drizzle trace down the glass, tiny rivers carrying dust away. When the phone finally stopped ringing, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I exhaled and looked toward the gray skyline, steady, unchanging, unbothered by the storm that had just passed through my morning. The notification came just before lunch, while I was reviewing reimbursement forms at my desk. A small red icon blinked on my phone, the kind reserved for things that can't wait. Bank alert, unusual withdrawal, $7,500. For a moment, I just stared at it, half convinced I'd read the number wrong. I had closed everything, every automatic payment, every linked card. There shouldn't have been a way. But there it was, the numbers bold and certain, a new bruise forming over old skin. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked down the hallway. The hospital corridors were their usual blur of muted blues and rushing footsteps, but everything felt sharper. Somehow the echo of shoes, the faint antiseptic in the air, the sound of my own heartbeat. The legal department sat in a quiet corner behind double glass doors. Ellen Kravitz looked up when I stepped in. She was younger than me by at least 20 years, brisk and bright, the kind of woman who always carried 3 pens and remembered everyone's coffee order. I'd worked with her for years, sharing polite smiles and brief updates about budgets, nothing more personal than that. But when she saw my face, her expression softened. "You okay?" "Can you spare a few minutes?" I asked. "Of course." I closed the door behind me and handed her my phone. Someone withdrew $7,500 from a joint account I thought I'd closed. She frowned, scrolling through the alert. "Do you have the account number?" I nodded and read it from memory. She typed, quickly pulling up her own screen. The soft tapping of her keyboard filled the silence. After a minute, her brow furrowed. "This account's still active," she said quietly. "It looks like there's been consistent activity for months. Large transfers, credit card payments, even a car loan." I felt a hollow pulse at my temples. "Can you show me?" Ellen turned the monitor toward me. Rows of transactions appeared, names of card issuers, auto finance companies, a travel agency, a boutique I didn't recognize. And then something that made the room tilt slightly. Mortgage inquiry. Pending approval. I gripped the edge of her desk. "Mortgage looks like someone used your name as cosigner," she said carefully. "I can't see the details from here, but you should call your bank's fraud division immediately." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Ellen leaned back, eyes narrowing, as she scrolled further. "Meredith, this isn't family support. This is financial abuse." The words landed with a strange precision. Not anger, not accusation, just truth, plain and undeniable. I stared at the screen at the life I'd been financing without permission. The restaurants, the clothing stores, the small glittering things that had nothing to do with rent or groceries. Each line was a reminder of every time I'd said just this once. My throat tightened, but I managed to ask, "Can you print everything?" Ellen nodded and hit the command. The printer whirred softly in the corner, spitting out pages that smelled faintly of toner and finality. When she handed them to me, the weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have. "Thank you," I said quietly. She hesitated. Do you want me to help you report it? Not yet, I said. I need to see it all first. As I walked back to my office, the pages pressed against my chest. The air outside the window had turned darker. Rain gathered on the glass, sliding down in long, uneven streaks. I thought of the night I'd said enough and realized that maybe the word had finally started working. Back in my office, the papers lay on the desk like a stack of small, polite disasters. The fluorescent light above hummed faintly steady and indifferent, while I sat there staring at the top page. The total sat at the bottom of the last column, typed in a neat black font that didn't seem capable of cruelty, $122,000 withdrawn over 6 years. I traced the number with my fingertip, slow disbelieving. I'd known it would be bad, but seeing it collected and labeled was something else entirely. Each figure carried a memory the month I worked overtime to cover a temporary emergency, the Christmas I skipped a trip because he needed a new car, the quiet pride I'd felt every time I told someone I was helping my son get on his feet. I had built my identity around those sacrifices brick by brick. The longer I looked, the less the numbers meant. They blurred into stories, into fragments of love and excuses. Until one line caught my eye. Authorization signature M. Calloway. 2 signatures side by side, his and mine. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My handwriting curved the way it always had, patient and careful. His next to it, quick, slanted, careless. That was him. Even his signature carried a kind of urgency, like the world owed him time. The paper trembled slightly as I lifted it. Ink bled under the corner where a tear had fallen before I realized I was crying. The betrayal didn't feel loud or dramatic. It felt private, like something that should have stayed between us. I wiped my cheek and stared again at the line of his name. Dylan Calloway, the boy who used to bring me burnt toast on Mother's Day, who once promised to take me to Italy when he made it big. The boy who had turned my trust into currency. The printer still smelled faintly of heat and toner, the scent oddly sharp in the air. I stacked the pages neatly, aligning the edges, as if tidiness could restore order to what I'd lost. There was no anger yet, only a hollow quiet that reached deep inside me. I folded the first page once, then again, sliding it into the folder I kept for tax records. My hands moved automatically, like they'd done this 1,000 times before, organizing, containing, surviving. Outside, the rain had stopped. The light over Portland had shifted gray, thinning into a pale, uncertain blue. I sat for a long time, the folder in my lap, the paper edges cool against my skin. It was all there now. Every truth, every line, every name that used to mean safety. Chapter 10. The Drive to Hawthorne Street. The rain started again just after noon, the kind that never quite stops in Portland. Steady, silver, patient. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the folder on the passenger seat like a second presence. Every so often it shifted slightly with the motion of the car, and I reached out to steady it as if it were alive, fragile, something that might break if I didn't hold it in place. Hawthorne Street stretched ahead of me in soft gray ribbons, lined with cherry trees, already heavy with pale pink blossoms. Their petals clung to the wet pavement, gathering along the curbs like little drifts of forgotten spring. It was a beautiful neighborhood, quiet, expensive, too polished for someone who'd once begged for rent money. I parked in front of a craftsman-style house with a blue door and perfectly trimmed hedges. Through the rain-blurred windshield, I could see a smart doorbell camera glowing faintly beside the handle. He hadn't answered any of my calls since the last explosion of voicemails, but I knew he'd be home. I stepped out of the car folder, clutched under my coat, and walked up the path. The air smelled faintly of wet cedar, and something floral lavender maybe. When I knocked, it took him a long time to open the door. Mom Dylan said his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. He looked older than I remembered, though not by much eyes. Tired jaw, unshaven, a kind of restless energy humming under his skin. "Can I come in?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough to make it an insult, then stepped aside. The warmth of the house hit me immediately, too thick, almost artificial. Everything gleamed: the granite countertops, the glass coffee table, the massive smart TV flickering in the corner. A candle burned on the kitchen island, something expensive with a name like Santal Smoke. "You came to scold me," he asked, his tone sharp, defensive before I'd even spoken. I set my coat over the back of a chair and looked around. "You've done well for yourself." His laugh was short. "You make it sound like a crime." I walked to the table and placed the folder there, sliding it across the surface until it stopped near his elbow. The pages inside shifted slightly, the weight of them unmistakable. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof," I said, "of what I've been paying for all these years." He stared at me then, at the folder, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You didn't have to drive all the way here to guilt-trip me. I know what you've done." "No," I said quietly. "You know what you've taken." The silence that followed felt heavy, stretching across the room like another wall. He flipped open the folder and glanced through the pages, scanning the transactions, the printouts, the signatures. I watched his jaw tighten when he reached the mortgage inquiry. "You shouldn't have gone through my business," he said. "It became my business when you used my name." He pushed the folder back toward me, the motion careless, dismissive. "You're being dramatic. I was just trying to get ahead. Everything I did was for the family, for you even. For me," I repeated. "You stole from me, Dylan. You forged my signature." "I wouldn't have had to if you hadn't made me depend on you all those years," he snapped. "You trained me to come to you for help. Don't pretend you didn't like it." His words hit deep, not because they were cruel, but because there was a twisted grain of truth in them. I had wanted to be needed. I had mistaken dependence for love. He folded his arms, glaring. "So what now? You cut me off completely. You just walk away like I'm some stranger." I took a slow breath. "No," I said. "I came to close the account and the story." He frowned, not understanding. "I'm not your lender, Dylan. I'm your mother. That's all I have left to be." The sound of rain filled the room, a soft drumming against the windows. He didn't answer. I reached for my coat, picked up the folder, and walked to the door. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the rain cooler on my skin. Behind me, the house loomed quiet, its light spilling out across the wet steps. I didn't look back. The petals from the cherry trees clung to my shoes as I walked to the car, pale and silent as paper. I had almost reached the door when a voice stopped me. "Wait." Erin stood in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression tight and bright with anger. She was still wearing her nurse's scrubs, pale blue, under the warm kitchen light. But there was nothing soft about her face. "He's doing his best," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray fatigue beneath the fury. "You don't understand what it's been like. He's been trying to keep this house, this family, everything together." I turned to face her. Dylan hovered behind her, now silent, jaw clenched, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. "This house," I said slowly, "was paid for, with money that wasn't his to spend." Erin's lips pressed into a hard line. "It's always about money with you, isn't it? You think everything can be measured in what you've given. Maybe you should ask yourself what you took." The words were meant to wound, and for a heartbeat they did. I could see the layers behind them, the exhaustion, the loyalty, the shared illusion that they were building something noble out of my sacrifices. But she didn't know the years that came before her. She didn't know the slow unraveling of trust that had started long before this marriage ever began. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I came to make things clear." Dylan stepped forward. "You've made them clear," he said, his voice rough. "You're cutting us off. You're done being part of this family." The word family struck a chord that felt both familiar and foreign. Once that word had been my anchor. Now it sounded like a chain. I looked at him, really looked at him, the curve of his shoulders, the way his anger seemed to fill every space in the room until there was no air left. I remembered that same posture when he was 5 years old, refusing to admit he'd broken the porch light and blaming the wind instead. The same pride, the same fear of being small. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "I'm not cutting you off. I'm letting go. There's a difference." Erin took a step forward, shaking her head. "You're punishing him. You always have. You just hide it behind your calm voice and your perfect logic." Her tone cracked on the word punishing, and I saw it then, the thin fracture of someone who'd been living beside his frustration for years, who had learned to speak in his defense because it was the only way to keep peace. A movement on the staircase caught my attention. Their son Michael, 15 maybe, stood halfway down barefoot, hair sticking up in soft brown tufts. He looked from his father to me, confusion etched into every line of his face. "Go back upstairs," Dylan said sharply. But the boy didn't move. He just stared silent, watching the adults circle each other with words that felt too large for the small living room. I took a breath and turned toward him. "Your dad and I are just talking," I said gently. "You don't need to worry." His eyes dropped to the floor. He nodded once and disappeared up the stairs, his steps light but quick. The moment he was gone, the silence that followed settled like dust. I raised a man. I said finally, my voice steady, "Not a client." Dylan flinched, the faintest shift in his expression, but said nothing. Erin's shoulders slumped, anger dissolving into something heavier. Resignation, maybe. I picked up my coat from the chair, slipped it on, and glanced once more around the room. The candle still burned on the counter, the smell of sandalwood sweet but suffocating. No one stopped me when I reached the door. The only sound was the rain easing against the windows and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with care. The air was cool, clean, and quiet, an honest quiet free of demands. The silence that followed me down the walkway felt heavier than shouting, but it was finally mine. The rain had eased into a thin mist by the time I reached the car. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the faint scent of wet upholstery. The porch light from Dylan's house glowed dimly through the rearview mirror, a small, trembling orb behind me. Then I started the engine and pulled away. Portland blurred past in soft streaks of color, neon signs, headlights, reflections smeared across the wet asphalt. Every red light seemed to last a little too long, the world holding its breath between one decision and the next. I kept the radio off. The silence was cleaner. At the first intersection, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Then again, then again. The screen lit up over and over Dylan's name, then Erin's, then an unfamiliar number that could only have been borrowed from someone else's phone. I let it ring. By the time I reached the bridge, I'd stopped glancing at the screen. The river below shimmered under the city lights, black and restless, carrying the reflection of everything above it. I pulled over for a moment and stared at the water, the windshield wipers clicking a steady rhythm. The phone kept vibrating, urgent and small like a trapped bird. I picked it up, opened the contact list, and scrolled. My thumb hesitated for just a second before pressing the first name, block this caller. The confirmation appeared. I pressed yes, then the next one, and the next. Each name disappeared quietly without ceremony until the list was clean again. When I was done, I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. It didn't move. The city stretched out ahead, glowing faintly in the drizzle. Streetlights shimmered in puddles like fractured constellations, and for the first time in years, there was no one demanding my attention on the other end of a screen. I drove the rest of the way home with the windows cracked, letting the damp air in. It smelled like earth and rain and something faintly electric. When I turned onto my street, the houses were dark except for mine. I cut the engine, and listened to the ticking of cooling metal. The silence was full, but not heavy. It filled every corner of the car, quiet but alive, as if the night itself had been waiting for me to make room. 3 weeks passed without a word. The quiet became its own kind of weather-steady cold at first, then strangely calm. I spent the days walking the river trail behind my house, letting time smooth the edges of everything sharp. The nights were long, but not unbearable. Sometimes I caught myself expecting the phone to light up again, but it never did. It was a Thursday when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. The sound startled me, not loud, but deliberate, 3 dull thuds against the wood. When I opened the door, Dylan stood there. He looked smaller somehow, though he hadn't lost weight. His clothes hung wrong, wrinkled and damp from the drizzle. His eyes were bloodshot, framed by exhaustion that made him seem both older and impossibly young. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Mom," he said finally, voice cracking on the word. "You destroyed me." I stepped back slightly, letting the rain-soaked air slip between us. "No," I said softly. I stopped destroying myself. He blinked as if the sentence didn't make sense. Then his face twisted, grief and anger knotted together. "You don't understand what you did. You ruined everything. The house, the car, my credit, they're gone." I stayed by the door, one hand on the frame. "They were never yours to build on, Dylan. You used my name, my money. All I did was stop the bleeding." He shook his head, pacing just beyond the threshold, wet shoes leaving small dark prints on the welcome mat. "You think you're so noble. But you didn't just hurt me, you hurt everyone." Erin left. She took Michael to her mother's. "She said she can't live like this." The words hit harder than I expected. I had never liked the girl's sharpness, but I hadn't wished this on her or their son. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I truly am. But this isn't something I can fix for you." He stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging. "You were supposed to be on my side," he whispered. "That's what parents do." I looked at him, the hollow eyes, the tremor in his jaw, the remnants of a boy who once brought me burned toast and coffee. "I was on your side," I said. "For 30 years, I was on your side. But being on your side started meaning losing mine." The rain outside thickened, tapping against the gutters like a metronome. He rubbed his face with both hands, his breath shuddering. "I just need time," he said. "A few months, maybe. I can find work. I can make this right." Something in me wanted to say yes, to open the door wider, to let him in, to cook him something warm and pretend the world hadn't split open between us. The impulse rose like muscle memory, the old rhythm of rescue. But I stayed where I was. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You always said you could." He stared at me, confused by the steadiness in my tone. Then his knees gave out. He sank onto the step, head bowed, hands gripping the edge of the porch. His shoulders shook once, then again, and I realized he was crying. I didn't move to comfort him. Not out of cruelty, but because I finally understood that comfort wasn't what he needed. Every time I'd reached out before, I'd built another bridge for him to burn. The rain softened, misting around us. I watched him struggle to catch his breath, his voice small when he finally spoke. "I don't know how to start over." "Then start small," I said. "Start honest." He looked up, eyes red, searching my face for something. Anger, forgiveness, anything familiar. All I could offer him was calm. After a while, he stood. "Can I at least call sometimes?" "You can," I said, "when you're ready to talk about something other than what I can give you." He nodded slowly, a hollow, uncertain motion. Then he turned, walking down the steps into the drizzle, his figure blurring against the pale gray street. I stayed at the doorway, watching until he reached the end of the block. When he disappeared around the corner, the porch felt strangely wider, the air lighter. I closed the door, leaning my forehead against the wood. The sound of the rain returned soft and constant. Somewhere in that rhythm, I felt both the ache of loss and the quiet pulse of freedom, two notes of the same song, finally in tune. It was early March when the news reached me. I was bringing groceries in from the car when my neighbor, Mrs. Keene, called out from her porch. She was the kind woman who always noticed things mail left too long in a box, a missing trash bin, an extra car parked on the street. "Meredith," she said, walking over in her garden shoes. "I saw something that might concern you. There's a foreclosure notice posted on that blue house over on Hawthorne. Isn't that your son's place?" The word foreclosure hung in the air, heavy as rain before a storm. I thanked her, managed a smile, and carried the last bag inside. My hands shook as I put away the milk and bread. The refrigerator door closed with a hollow sound, and the quiet that followed felt like an answer I'd already known was coming. That evening, I drove to Hawthorne Street. The cherry trees were just beginning to bloom again, petals pale as smoke. The same house stood at the corner, the blue paint a little duller now. A sheet of paper was taped to the front door, yellow edges fluttering in the wind. Even from the car, I could make out the bold black letters, "Notice of foreclosure." I parked a little further down, out of sight. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the chill of something ending. Through the large living room window, I saw light, a soft, uneven glow that reached only halfway across the floor. Dylan was inside, sitting cross-legged on the carpet. Michael was beside him, the boy's head resting against his father's chest. They weren't talking. Dylan's arms wrapped around his son, tight but fragile, like someone holding on to something that was already slipping away. I watched them from the car, the engine-off hands folded in my lap. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves. I saw the man and the boy, but I also saw the echo of the child. He'd been the same one who used to curl up beside me after nightmares, clutching my sleeve until sleep took him back. My throat tightened. I wanted to step out, to knock, to tell him it wasn't too late to start again. But I didn't move. There was a kind of mercy in staying still, in letting him sit with what was his to carry. Some lessons couldn't be given, only lived. The light inside flickered as he reached for the lamp, adjusting it absently. Michael shifted in his arms, and Dylan pressed a hand over his son's hair, a small, almost tender gesture that broke me in a way I hadn't expected. I stayed until the streetlights flickered on the sky, dimming into blue-gray dusk. Then I turned the key in the ignition, careful not to draw attention. As I drove away, the reflection of their window disappeared in the side mirror, swallowed by distance and shadow. My chest ached, but it wasn't the sharp pain I'd known before. It was quieter, deeper, something closer to mourning than loss. a heartbreak that didn't demand to be fixed, only acknowledged. By the time I reached home, the first stars had appeared. I parked, turned off the headlights, and sat for a moment in the dark. Somewhere inside me, the ache settled into stillness, like a stone resting on the bottom of a river. Heavy, unmoving, but no longer sinking. The first time I walked into the therapist's office, I nearly turned back. The room was too calm, too bright sunlight spilling through gauzy curtains, soft chairs arranged in patient symmetry. I had spent my life fixing things, managing numbers, balancing everyone else's chaos. Sitting in a place designed for stillness felt like being asked to breathe underwater. The therapist, a woman named Lila Hart, had kind eyes and the kind of voice that didn't demand answers. She offered me tea I didn't want, and I accepted it anyway. We sat for a while before she spoke. "You've carried a lot alone," she said. It wasn't a question, and somehow that made it easier to nod. Over the next weeks, we traced my history in quiet fragments, the years after my husband's death, the long string of "I'll handle it" moments that had built my life. Every crisis had become a small test of endurance, every solution a brick in a wall I'd built around myself. I'd mistaken control for care, survival for strength. "I think you believed love meant holding everything together," Lila said one afternoon. "Even when no one asked you to. Especially when no one did." Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. For days, I thought about the ledger of my life, the unspoken debts, the balance between giving and keeping. I began to see how the numbers had never really been about money. They were about permission. Somewhere along the way, I'd made caretaking my language. It was how I said I'm here, how I kept people close. But love isn't supposed to be a transaction. When spring came, I found myself at a community center near downtown volunteering for a women's financial literacy program. The first evening, I stood in front of a small group, single mothers, retirees, women starting over after divorce, and felt a flicker of something I hadn't known in years: belonging. I taught them simple things: how to read a loan contract, how to separate wants from needs, how to say no without apology. But as I spoke, I realized I was still teaching myself. One woman, maybe 40, raised her hand after class. "It's hard," she said softly, "when the people you love are the ones you need to set boundaries with." I smiled, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "It is hard," I told her, "but it's not unkind." When the session ended, I stayed behind to stack chairs and wipe the whiteboard clean. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic, steady and distant. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: quiet that didn't ache. The kind that felt earned. The kind that waits for no one but still holds space for everything that remains. The closet had become a museum of old promises. On a quiet Saturday morning, I opened its door and let the faint scent of cedar and thyme spill into the room. Dust rose in thin spirals through the light from the window, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to sort through what remained. Most of the clothes were practical work: blouses, winter sweaters, scarves folded in careful stacks. But toward the back, beneath an old garment bag, I found them Dylan's graduation suit and a designer coat I'd bought years ago to impress his in-laws. The suit was navy, the kind every department store insists will make a young man look successful. I had spent a week's salary on it, telling myself it was an investment in his future. I could still remember how proud he'd looked standing on the stage that day, cap slightly crooked, sunlight catching the edge of his smile. He'd hugged me afterward and whispered, "I'll pay you back for everything, Mom." The coat was another story. A soft gray wool tailored just right, the kind of thing that felt too expensive for the life I actually lived. I'd worn it to their engagement dinner, surrounded by people who spoke about ski trips and wine cellars. I'd told myself that if I looked the part, maybe I'd belong in that world, maybe he'd be proud to have me there. I ran my hand over the sleeve, now the fabric smooth under my fingers. It didn't hurt anymore, not like it used to. These weren't symbols of failure. They were markers of how far I'd carried the illusion of being enough for someone else. That afternoon, I packed both items carefully and drove to the youth shelter on Burnside. The building was small but bright, a mural of painted hands covering one wall. Inside, volunteers sorted donations and folded clothes into neat piles. A woman at the desk, her name tag read, Janet, greeted me with a smile. "Just drop them here," she said, gesturing to a rack by the counter. I hesitated for a moment, then unzipped the garment bag. The suit and coat hung there like old ghosts, dignified and silent. Janet's eyes softened when she saw them. "These are beautiful. They'll mean a lot to someone." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I turned to leave, a boy, maybe 16, walked in from the back room. He was tall and thin, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too small. Janet held up the coat. "Want to try this one?" He slipped his arms into the sleeves, and for a second the fabric seemed to recognize him. He looked down, tugged at the buttons, and then smiled, wide, genuine, unguarded. The kind of smile that belongs only to someone seeing themselves clearly for the first time. I felt a warmth bloom quietly in my chest. Not sadness, not nostalgia, but something gentler. The coat fit him perfectly. "Keep it," I said softly. He looked up surprised and nodded. When I stepped back outside, the air was crisp and clean. The sun had broken through the clouds, scattering pale light across the wet pavement. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, feeling lighter in a way that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with release. The air smelled like rain and lilac when evening settled over the street. Spring had arrived quietly, softening the edges of everything, the lawns, the trees, even the sky. The cherry blossoms along the sidewalk had begun to fall, scattering pale petals across the porch steps, like confetti from a celebration I hadn't realized I'd earned. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching the last light fade from the clouds. The house behind me hummed with its small, familiar sounds. The refrigerator clicking on the clock, ticking in the kitchen, the faint rustle of wind through half-open windows. The same porch had once been my watchtower. Years ago, I'd stood there waiting for Dylan to come home from parties, from college breaks, from arguments that stretched too far. Each time I'd left the porch light on, telling myself it was for his safety. In truth, it had been for mine. It was the one thing I could still control the light steady and constant when everything else was slipping. Now, as I reached for the switch, the metal felt cool under my fingers. The bulb flickered once, then glowed warm and steady, casting a soft halo across the rain-damp yard. I whispered to the empty air, "This light isn't for waiting anymore. It's for peace." The words felt right, like they'd been sitting quietly inside me for years, waiting for their moment. I thought of my husband, the one who'd wired the fixture himself decades ago, muttering about how every home needs a beacon. I smiled at the memory, the way his hands had always smelled faintly of copper and soap, the way he'd looked at me when the light first turned on, proud of something so simple. The rain began again, gentle this time, barely more than a mist. It gathered on the railing, on the edges of the light's glass cover, on the tips of my fingers. I didn't move to go inside. The air was cool but kind, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting for a phone call, a text, or a knock at the door. The phone in my pocket stayed silent, and that silence no longer frightened me. It felt like space room to breathe, to remember to begin again. I looked out at the quiet street, at the wet reflections of the streetlights stretching across the pavement, and drew a slow, deep breath. My chest rose easily. There was no weight pressing against it, no ache beneath the rhythm, just the steady beat of something still alive, still open. The light shone on unwavering, as if it had always known what it was meant for.